If you haven't watched my previous entry of the 14th, I strongly suggest that you do that. Because if you haven't actually seen with your own eyes the way these famous plagiarists lie and had it demonstrated to you in real time, nothing I say is going to make any sense to you. Because in the back of your mind, it's always going to be short-circuited because you have an idea of the excuses that these plagiarists have given for these various things, these rationales. And therefore, as I said, it'll short circuit everything that I try to tell you about Mathew Franklin Whittier and Abipoyan Whittier's actual authorship of these pieces. But when you see that they're just telling barefaced lies, just shameless lies, then what I'm saying might get through. So I suggest that you stop right now and go back and watch that one. We've had, assuming they aren't duplicates, we've had 15 hits. We really need at least 40 because I've had as many as 40 people look at these. All 40 need to be all on the same page with this. So now recently I have just posted a short biography, a biographical sketch in a paper of Mathew Franklin Whittier. I didn't go into Abby's history very much, but it summarizes Mathew's personal history as I understand it at this point after 11 years of research. And I think this has been desperately needed. That's what I started out trying to do with my book, Mathew Franklin Whittier in His Own Words, and it just burgeoned out of control because I kept finding more evidence and because I was trying to prove everything in that book. I was trying to prove my own past life reincarnation case, and it turned out I had to prove a whole bunch of these plagiarisms. And proof is time-consuming and tedious, so the book just got totally out of control. So what we needed was an actual biography of Mathew that you could sit down and read at one sitting that would give you a pretty good idea of who he was. That I have done now. It's in my article section and also on Academia EDU. What I want to show today is just how autobiographical Mathew's work was, including this work, which is falsely claimed by some of his plagiarists, famous and otherwise. So I want to use one example, a lesser known example, or practically unknown example at this point, just to give you an idea of how much of himself and how much of his own life he secretly embedded in these fictional works of various kinds. So today we're going to be talking about a particular period in Mathew's life. I'm going to go into some detail. I'm going to try to take my time. I may wander a little bit, but I really don't want to leave anything out. I want to give you a good idea of what was going on. So towards the end of Mathew and Abby's marriage, before she died, she was getting sick from consumption, which is to say tuberculosis, and Matthew's business was failing. He had a stove business. He had picked a bad partner, and they were in the middle of a recession still, and things were going downhill. So they had to live in a hotel room, as I gather, that was provided by distant relatives. I think it was drafty. It was terribly cold. They lost their 8-month-old daughter, Sarah, and then 2 weeks later, Abby was dead. She had been taken about a week before she died. Her 2 sisters had come and taken her back to her father's house. Now, that was a huge humiliation and sacrifice for Mathew. And the reason is that they had to elope. Her father was a marquis. She was upper class. He refused to let them marry. They had to elope. And he made it very difficult for them. Apparently, even after they eloped, he made it difficult. He may have actually privately worked behind the scenes to destroy Mathew's credit by making his creditors pull out. It's hard to say. There's a hint we'll see about that. But at any rate, Mathew did drink. I think they both did, as it was normal back then. But under pressure, I think Mathew's drinking may have gotten a bit out of control. Probably not too terribly much. I think there were jealousy issues that came up. I also think that they were getting poisoned by lead. I think there was lead in the pipes. I think there was lead in the cheap pewter that they had to use. I think there was lead in the cheap wine that they drank. Remember that Abby was French, so wine was normal with dinner, and cheap wine had like a little bit of lead at the bottom or something to sweeten it. So I think that lead poisoning affects your mind, and I think that was happening. So when Abby died, I think apparently, I don't know how their daughter Sarah died. It seems like she wouldn't have died of tuberculosis because she wasn't old enough for that to develop, but I guess it's possible. A psychic medium that I employed very early on in this research in 2010 thought that maybe one of the children had died in a fire. Well, we know the first one did not, so it's possible that they had to ask somebody to take care of Sarah under the circumstances, and children's clothing would catch fire on candles and fireplaces and stuff. So she could have died in a fire. If that had happened, Abby would have been absolutely devastated. And apparently she let herself go. That's the inference in all of this. And Mathew couldn't stop her. The first time he'd managed to pull her out of it by inducing her to start working with him on A Christmas Carol. The second time he couldn't pull her out of it. So finally, in desperation, he contacted her sisters who had helped them when Sarah was born. And they came and took Abby back to her father's house. Well, I'm pretty sure that her father had said he would never help Abby unless she left Mathew. So sending her back home was like a defeat for him, but he was willing to do it for her sake because he thought maybe being around her family and her sisters and her mother might be able to pull her out of it. Well, it didn't, and she died about a week later. Mathew apparently went through a terrible period of survivor's guilt. And as you see, if you watch these psychic mediums that connect people with their loved ones on the other side, many of them express terrible survivor's guilt. If only they had done this, if only they had done that, if only they hadn't said this cruel, mean thing when they were arguing, the last thing they talked about, whatever it is, and they obsess, they go over and over about it. And maybe it wasn't really that bad. It was just a normal argument, or maybe they, just hadn't said, I love you as much as they wished they'd had, or maybe they got a little distracted with work, or who knows what it is, but it gets magnified way out of proportion and they cannot forgive themselves. Well, Mathew apparently went through this. And I'm going to take this opportunity to show you two instances where he embeds this little autobiographical detail in his work. Both of these, no, I take that back. One of these was claimed by somebody else who couldn't possibly have written it. And this is what I want to show. The other one is not. The other one is clearly Mathew's work. So that's kind of a nice mix because one of them definitely is, we can prove it, and the other one obviously couldn't have been, even though historians still swallow it, see? So we're going to turn to the January 4, 1851 Boston Weekly Museum. You can see how humongous this thing is. And in it, there is something from Mathew's series about Ethan Spike and Hornby. Now, Mathew is definitely known historically as the author of Ethan Spike. So there's no question about that. There's no controversy. Mathew was Ethan Spike. But he would create spin-offs, other characters that came from his fictional town of Hornby. Well, here he has created one for the Boston Weekly Museum named Perseverance W. Spike. The W is almost for sure for Whittier, and this is 1851 is about 6 years before Mathew was exposed as the author of Ethan Spike. So it's just a secret little reference here. This is a letter from Hornby, Maine, which is supposedly written on December 19th, 1850, the previous year. And there's a lot in this I won't go through. At some point, he begins talking about Ossian Dodge, an entertainer. Ossian Dodge was a humorous entertainer who was also a temperance man, and that was his big claim to his moral fame, was not drinking. But he was really a con artist. He falsely claimed Mathew's travelogue in this Boston Weekly Museum signed as Quails, which I've gone into many times before. It's a long history. Dodge was never Quails. He was not Quails. It was always Mathew. But Mathew tended to partner with the wrong people and to get fooled by these characters. And he got fooled by Dodge's external squeaky clean image, see, which the public also did. Dodge was actually kind of a sociopath, basically, but he got fooled by it. And he writes about, as Perseverance W. Spike, he writes about attending one of Dodge's concerts and about how funny it was and so on. But then he talks about Dodge's moralistic songs, see, his anti-drinking songs. And this is how it affected him. Remember, this is Matthew writing as Perseverance W. Spike, and Matthew embeds a great deal of himself in these. But he not only makes folks laugh when he pleases, but he sets them a-crying just as easy. He sung one song about a little boy whose father got drunk and left his family to starve and freeze to death. It cut just like a knife, and almost everybody sniffled. For my part, arter holding on as long as I could, I gin in and bawled right out, and the next day my best yaller waistcoat looked just as though it had been dipped in the pork barrel. The tears had run over it so. So there's one little line in here that gives it away. Maybe you noticed it. It cut just like a knife. That's the personal side. That means Matthew related to it, and it touched his guilt, see? So that means that Matthew's telling us that he had something like that to be guilty about personally, okay? So that's our first reference, and we will put this magnificent old volume back down here. I can't tell you what I feel when I pick up those things. I definitely get a feeling, especially when I smell it, but I can't describe it. It's an excitement. There's an excitement about the old newspapers when I pick them up, and I really can't get too much beyond that to describe it. Now, this is a very rare original copy of a book called The Rag Picker, or Bound and Free, which was published anonymously in 1855 by Mathew Franklin Whittier. At the front, I've shared this before, at the front is a dedication to his sister, Elizabeth Whittier, although it's not signed to her, of course. And it says, "To my sister, the firm and unwavering friend of oppressed humanity, and of the poor, the unfortunate, and the erring everywhere, this volume is affectionately dedicated by its author." Now, this volume is now attributed to George Pickering Burnham, who was one of Matthew's plagiarists. He was a racist, which I can prove. He was a con artist, apparently was wealthy, and he stepped in 2 months after this book was published and by trickery tried to associate his name with it. It's a long story as to why he would do that. He had plagiarized a great deal of Matthew's work in the past. He and a partner, Francis A. Duravage, apparently tricked Matthew into signing a bogus contract, which gave them absolute and complete rights over Matthew's entire unpublished portfolio, which they proceeded to publish. So Matthew panned, anonymously in a review, panned George Burnham's book, which was based on one of the stories they'd stolen from Matthew, not one of the ones Burnham took, but one of the ones Duravage took as his own. So he elaborated on that, made a book of it, and Matthew panned it because whereas Matthew would write cautionary stories about scams, Burnham ran the scam and then wrote an ostensibly humorous book bragging on the scam that he himself had run. See, totally opposite, even though it looked similar on the surface. So Matthew exposed that, and Burnham turned around in retaliation and tried to associate his name with this book, which was utterly absurd because this is a deeply moral book, obviously written by a committed social reformer, which Matthew had been for many, many years. It was glowingly reviewed by William Lloyd Garrison in The Liberator. The second half of this is all anti-slavery, involves the Underground Railroad and everything else. The first half has to do with the evils of alcoholism and poverty and debtor's prison and things of that nature, see. There's no possible way that George Burnham could ever have written it. It's utterly absurd. But what he did was very tricky. He had money. So this was published in New York City. George Burnham bought a publishing company. It was Fetterhen and Company, and he now made it Burnham, Fetterhen and Company. He owned it just long enough to advertise this book with himself as the author. That was the way that he associated his name with it. And then somebody in one of the Boston papers, the Boston Herald, that's the one he advertised in, got hold of it and said that he was the author. And then another paper in Boston, the True Flag, wrote a little article saying that at last the real author of The Ragpicker has been found, and it's George Burnham. That's all I found anywhere, just those little references in Boston. And then all that was forgotten. The ads continue to run, Matthew's ads. Was published by Mason Brothers in New York, and it was forgotten. But some historian who was including a little biographical sketch about George Burnham included in that he was the author of The Ragpicker. And then sometime in 1953 or something, somebody else picked that up and included it in a long bibliography. And then some librarian picked it up from there and wrote in the front cover, which I've erased in this book very carefully, that George Burnham was the author. And then that copy with George Burnham's name penciled in as the author got digitized and sent to all the other libraries all over the world. And they all accepted uncritically, without looking into it, that George Burnham was the author. And then the booksellers who reprint on demand, for colleges, I guess, they put his name on the front cover of it as the author. So now it's set in concrete. You can't touch it. I have tried and tried, well, not tried and tried. I've tried several times and then given up to get somebody to take my part to get this changed. And while one or two sellers of antiquarian books paid attention to what I said, one of them actually pulled his listing, I think. By and large, nobody will touch it with a 10-foot pole. Once it's in the historical record, however false it is, nobody will touch it because now it's fact with a capital F-A-C-T. Just like Charles Dickens' authorship of A Christmas Carol, just like Edgar Allan Poe's authorship of The Raven. These things are now fact. Nobody dare question them, certainly nobody outside of academia. Well, I'm getting on my high horse. So this is The Ragpicker. And what I'm going to do is read a chapter which is clearly autobiographical. It clearly reflects not necessarily accurate details historically, but it reflects Matthew's emotional experience of this period in his life when he felt so terribly guilty that basically he hadn't tried his best to take care of Abby. He was too busy with his own jealousy fears or his own drinking or his own worries about the business. And, he let things slip away from him, and he lost both his daughter and his wife, and he blames himself terribly. Well, this is all reflected in this. And this is what we find with these works. The Raven and Annabel Lee are both deeply autobiographical. They have no bearing on Edgar Allan Poe whatsoever. He didn't write The Raven in anticipatory grief, quote unquote, for his wife Virginia's death. He didn't write Annabel Lee about her death either. He didn't write either of them. It's all Matthew writing about his own life, and it's clear once you look into it. Lady Geraldine's Courtship and Wine of Cyprus were not written by the future Elizabeth Barrett Browning about her relationship with her mentor, Hugh Stuart Boyd. They were written by Matthew about his courtship with Abby when she was 15 and 16. And there's some plausible connections with these plagiarists, but the backstory for Matthew is far deeper and far more authentic and far more on target than it could possibly be for the plagiarists. When you compare them, you'll see, and that's one reason I think it's important that I wrote this biographical sketch of Mathew Franklin Whittier. If people are familiar with his life, because they're terribly scared of my longer books, they won't touch them, They're too big, and they've got too much proof in them, to be honest. Well, this biographical sketch doesn't have the proof. It lets you go back and look at the original ebooks if you want the proof, and it just tells the story. When they see the story, and then they go back into books like this, and they see how closely these works reflect Matthew's own personal life, then they'll see what I'm talking about. So I'm kind of building something, you know. One of these video blogs addresses this aspect and one addresses this aspect. The last video blog addressed the aspect of the credibility of the plagiarists, which they did not have at all. That's an important part of the puzzle. And then this tendency of Matthew to write veiled autobiography is another important part of the puzzle, which is what I'm addressing today. So this is going to take us a little while. This is chapter 4. It's called The Elson Family. And this young couple had to elope because her father, who was from England, a wealthy, like an aristocrat from England, had prevented them from marrying, had not given permission, and they had to elope. And he had cut them off, or cut her off, see? Well, Abby's father was a marquis from France. I mean, actually from Guadeloupe, but then from France before that the family was. And he had similarly refused permission for Abby to marry, and they had to elope. So it's a very close parallel here. Now, this is not very flattering toward Matthew at all, because he's expunging his guilt here. See, he's expressing his guilt. Even in 1855, and Abby died in 1841, it's still with him, see. Okay, the Elson family, and there's a quote from Byron. He loved to quote Byron. He had no breath, no being, but in hers. She was his voice. She was his life. And then there's some asterisk indicating a break. A change came o'er the spirit of my dream. Signed Byron. And he begins. I'm going to bring this down so I can see what I'm doing a little better. For 3 years, from the day of their nuptials, Henry and Annie Elson were as happy in their social and family relations as they could well be, with the single qualification that the wife had never been able to obtain her father's forgiveness for what he termed her, quote, ingratitude. At first, old Britton, that's her father, raved and cursed his child. Then he threatened Elson with a suit at law for the abduction of his daughter, which Abby's father actually did try to use the law against Matthew and Abby, apparently, had her arrested. Then he became calmer, but never better disposed toward either the runaways. Foiled and baffled in all his early schemes to annoy his son-in-law, he finally commenced a secret war upon his credit in the business community, which had its effect in the end. This was the first clue I had, because this works both ways. I learned things from these about Matthew's life that he wouldn't say openly. When Matthew and Abby eloped to Dover, New Hampshire from Haverhill, Massachusetts, he opened a dry goods store, but it folded. And Matthew is telling us, apparently, that Abby's father, Joseph Poyen, worked behind the scenes to destroy his credit by getting his creditors to pull out. See? So he ensured Matthew's failure there. But Henry Elson was then an honorable, high-minded man, and he did not retaliate upon his wife's father when he was amply able to do so. His world of happiness was in the companionship of his darling wife, and Annie gave back his love and devotion with all the purity and fervor and earnestness of her confiding and grateful heart. That was the nature of Matthew and Abby's relationship. They were soulmates. Immediately upon their return from Providence, after the marriage, Elson bore his bride to his neatly furnished house in a quiet street at the west end of the city, where they settled at once and, with a single female servant, continued to live in the enjoyment of the modest comforts of life, but always contented with their lot and with each other. Henry could not and did not lose sight of the fact that his fondly loved wife had made an extraordinary sacrifice in leaving the splendid home of her wealthy parent to join her fate with his moderate and inconsiderable, not to say dubious, fortune. Now, that was also true of Abby. Matthew knew that Abby had made a huge sacrifice in eloping with him and leaving her upper-class background. In the Raven, you will see purple curtains and a purple velvet cushion. Those were things that either Abby had left over from her upbringing, as an upper-class French girl, or that Mathew had purchased for her. Velvet was expensive back then, to make her feel more at home. But I gather that he would buy things at, secondhand at auctions that were kind of upscale and to make her feel more comfortable. And Abby was kind of horrified at secondhand things, but never said anything because she didn't want to hurt Mathew's feelings. It's something that's just come to me. There's a little bit of proof for that. He was, at that time, in business upon his own account, which Mathew also was, in Dover. That's a matter of historical record. And he entertained no doubt that he was abundantly able to marry. But he soon found that, from some unknown cause, trade was not so promising as it had been. Now, that was true for Mathew. I had always assumed that it was because, A, they were abolitionists and they were shunned because of that. B, Abby was shunned as a witch, which I also have some evidence for, but not in Dover, later on. Or C, because the panic of 1837, hit the nation, having to do with Andrew Jackson and how he dealt with the banks and so on, which I don't totally understand. I think he was against local state banks and for the national bank, and somehow it caused an economic crash. But anyway, those three factors were involved. But apparently there was a fourth factor that Mathew wasn't aware of, and that was Joseph Poyen was messing with his creditors. So all of this is pretty much on the money historically. And then he observed a disposition on the part of creditors within 12 months from the day of his nuptials to shun him when he sought new accommodations or an increase of facilities. The secret poison of his vengeful and determined father-in-law was silently at work, but Elsa knew nothing, suspected nothing of this. So in a way, Mathew is telling posterity, for anybody who cares to listen, what happened in Dover. Annie strove in every way compatible with duty and honor to conciliate her unforgiving father, but all to no purpose. Historically, about 2 weeks, I think, after, if I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong about that, about 2 weeks after they eloped, Abby went back to her family home to try to reconcile with her father. Apparently, reading between the lines, there's one letter from Abby to her sister that reveals all this if you read it very carefully. He had her arrested and charged her with having stolen her own jewelry because a woman's property did not belong to her in that day. It belonged either to her father or to her husband. If he could make the marriage null and void, then she had taken his property because she had taken, I think, a tiara and a brooch with a big pearl in it and some jewelry like that, probably as a hedge, And he could charge her with having stolen his property. And so she was not allowed to leave her hometown of Rocks Village. And she was not allowed to have anything to do with Mathew during that period. And they got around it, but that's another story. It's in my books. She wrote letter after letter to him, beseeching him to be reasonable and to permit her to throw herself at his feet, and in person, humbly to crave his leniency and mercy. He received her touching appeals at first with violence and continued curses, and finally he thrust her letters into the fire unopened. Now, what happened with Mathew and Abby was they named their first child Joseph after him, Joseph Poyen Whittier, first and last name, and it didn't move him apparently. So, and she went and tried to make peace, and he had her arrested. I think he was trying to send her to a finishing school in Paris. But the problem was he was very class conscious. His family was actually connected with the royal crown in France, and apparently he was being very class conscious. He would not have her marry beneath her class. And not only that, he had poured quite a bit of money into her education, and he wanted to recoup the funds by marrying her to somebody with money. Because when he had fled a slave uprising with his father had fled a slave uprising in Guadeloupe, and they'd come to America, they probably didn't get all their money out. They got out enough, but not nearly their whole fortune. So he wanted to replenish the Poyan stores, see? So he was hoping to marry off his daughters well. And here Abby wanted to marry a poor farm boy and a struggling merchant, you know. And he was never going to be reconciled to it, you know, because she was basically livestock, you know, in his view. It was, you know, all a practical matter that he had to marry her off to somebody wealthy to increase his family funds. So it was never going to work. Of course, she never suspected that he was that selfish, you know. This is the father speaking. "She is dead," he said at length. "My daughter is dead to me, and mine forever. I will be avenged upon him, however. He shall not escape me," speaking of his son-in-law, "as he fancies he will. I will crush him to the earth, and through him the ingrate child shall feel my power sooner or later. She has braved the father's vengeance, and I will pursue her and her seducer to the death." And he kept his promise, though he was unsuspected. Well, I was going to read this whole chapter. And what happens is things go downhill. He begins drinking. She sticks by him faithfully and prays, and things get worse and worse. Their children die, and eventually he comes around. Eventually he gives up alcohol and shows his worth to somebody who helps him, gets him back on his feet, and they start afresh, see, and it's a happy ending for them. Of course, it wasn't a happy ending for Matthew, because Abby, having contracted tuberculosis, probably helping one of Matthew's relatives, died in March 27, 1841, and their daughter Sarah died a couple weeks before. So it was an utter tragedy for Matthew, and he never forgave himself for anything he did that was selfish or anything that he could have done, you know, to help Abby. Although really, I don't think it was his fault. He probably did drink. He probably was preoccupied with his business. There probably was jealousy squabbles when they were under such horrible pressure. But, you know, his heart was definitely in the right place, and he desperately tried to save her like he had when they lost their first child. But that guilt, when somebody dies, that guilt is just overwhelming. It's just crushing. So he expressed it in this book. But I think that we can see from just that much how Matthew would express his own deeply personal history in all of these stories, not just these two that I've read, but basically all of them. Either they have some deep philosophical message or a warning to people. When he wrote about scams, he was trying to warn people. Like when he wrote a series for the Yankee Doodle humorous magazine in New York, which was the first humorous magazine in America, patterned after Britain's Punch. He wrote a series called Attempts at Seeing the Elephant, I think it's called. And his character was Joshua Greening, and he was a country bumpkin that had come from a little town in New York, in this case, to New York City. And each chapter of this serialized story shows Joshua Greening getting scammed in a different way. But it was mostly a cautionary tale. It was trying to warn young men coming from the city to New York, coming from the country rather, to New York, about the various scams that they could fall into. So Matthew would write cautionary tales. But an awful lot of what he wrote was veiled autobiography, and an awful lot of that was about Abby and his relationship with Abby Poyan, their courtship, her death, and everything in between. Quite a few of these plagiarized works, as I've said, contain this as well. This book, claimed falsely by George P. Burnham, has a great deal of autobiography in it. The Raven has a great deal of autobiography in it. It's a literal account up to the point that the Raven enters the room. Everything's literal. It literally was in December, because that was a few months after Abby's death in March. He literally was studying her books late at night, including her metaphysical books. He literally was hoping for a visitation from her. He literally heard something outside the window and thought maybe somebody was at the door, but he was secretly hoping it was her, and he was terrified of it at the same time. He literally was struggling with his faith in the afterlife. The whole thing, you know, it wasn't made up the way that Edgar Allan Poe describes in Philosophy of Composition. It was autobiographical. It was Matthew's own life. Lady Geraldine courtship was literally his courtship with Abby. All he's done is to turn her into an older daughter of an earl in England instead of a younger daughter of a marquis in America. Everything else is what they did. She tutored him. They went out in the country. She sang for him. They studied. He read some of his poetry to her, and so on. The whole thing. Annabel Lee is an account of Abby's death, which includes that detail that her high-born sisters came and took her back to Joseph Poyen's home. And there's many, many more examples. So this is just another element of this story. Again, I would strongly suggest two things. I suggest that you go back and watch the previous entry, because I have caught Charles Dickens lying. I have caught Edgar Allan Poe lying. I've caught Elizabeth Barrett Browning lying. I've caught Albert Pike lying. And I've caught Margaret Fuller expressing her outrageous egotism. You know, Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of the true geniuses of the period, quotes Margaret Fuller as saying that she has met everyone worth meeting in America, and she has found no intellect comparable to her own. Well, that obviously would include Ralph Waldo Emerson, right? Which is utterly absurd, you know. So I caught her lying as well. All of them. Outrageous lies, obvious lies. You need to watch that if you haven't seen it, because there's no wiggle room in here. These people are telling barefaced lies. They are not credible. They are plagiarists. They're phonies, all of them. They're all literary imposters. So there we have it. I see a very interesting picture out there in terms of stats of who's looking at my presentation and who isn't, because this material is inherently radical and profound and genuine. So the reaction to that is profoundly ambivalent. You know, you have some people that are fascinated and read the whole thing. You have other people that read 2 pages and push it all away, say, oh, no, you know. Some people see reincarnation and they immediately dismiss it. Other people see reincarnation and say, oh, well, maybe, you know. The reactions are various out there, but they're kind of extreme. And yet, nobody reaches out to me and says, I want to know more. Nobody buys my books and says, I want to know more about this. You know, perhaps most importantly, nobody acknowledges the power of this thing. This is big. I found someone, never mind whether I was him or not. I'm not him now, except in a particular sense. But I found a dark horse, a hidden historical literary figure, 2 of them, if you include Abby, who had a major, major influence on the literary history of the United States and Europe. And it's all been hidden because they refused to come out and challenge the plagiarists who falsely claimed their work. So we've had these big lies floating around as facts in every textbook, in every classroom, in every thesis, in every dissertation, in every major literary work. Hundreds or thousands of scholars, of erudite scholars, have built their careers on these lies, believing them to be real. The whole thing's got to be wiped away, and it'll have to be started from scratch. You know, anything that has to do with Charles Dickens or Edgar Allan Poe or Margaret Fuller or Elizabeth Barrett Browning or Albert Pike is going to have to be looked at from scratch, wiped out, and started over. That's huge. Just think about the magnitude of this thing and the humble pie that's going to have to be eaten. You know, uh, and it's not their fault. They've just been fooled. They've been scammed. That's all. It's the perfect storm because you have three elements. You've got exceptionally talented writers who remained entirely anonymous and who were plagiarized by people who had the gift of fame, you know. And when you put those three factors together, you get this incredible situation where everybody is fooled. Everybody thinks Charles Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, even though he's obviously a liar, a poor character, and he obviously couldn't possibly have written A Christmas Carol. Once you understand what that story is, once you get into it and you really understand what it is, and you look at who Charles Dickens was, he couldn't possibly have written it. Same thing goes for Edgar Allan Poe in these two poems, The Raven and Annabel Lee. He couldn't possibly have written them. He was a sociopath. He was a scammer. He had no ability to write poetry like that. And so on with the others. It's like one of these things, these optical illusions that you can't see it and you can't see it, and people try to point it out to you and you can't see it, and they say there's the eyes and there's the nose, and you're looking and you can't see it, and suddenly you see it. Then you can't stop seeing it once you see it. That's what this discovery is like. It's ludicrous. You can't see it until you see it. So here's the way to see it. The way to see it is to go back to my entry of the 14th and watch me expose each of these plagiarists as barefaced liars. Then you'll see it. Bang. Okay? So I hope you've made it to the end of this. I hope you've found it interesting. I hope I've made one of the points that needs to be made, and I hope you'll go back and look at that entry if you haven't seen it, and I hope you'll read the biographical sketch that I just posted about Mathew Franklin Whittier.